this really became a snowball of events that began to shape my life and our lives, because we first of all, we become missionaries, so we became a part of the mission organization in Oklahoma, and there were a lot of Indian missionaries. Some of them were native, some of them were Anglo, and I need to go back. I need to go back to one other thing on my background. My father come out of West Virginia, and he had Cherokee blood in him. He could have been on the roll as a quarter Cherokee. My mother came out of Missouri, and she had Indian blood. And so there was some Indian blood in our, and we have found over the years as being a missionary that it's not how much Indian blood you've got, but where your heart is. And we never made a big issue. I know that I have enough Indian blood that I could have been on Cherokee rolls, and but never went that direction. Well, when we become missionaries, we begin to rub shoulders with many of the missionaries that were there in Oklahoma. And also as missionaries, we became involved in what they called World Mission Conferences. These is where the missionary would go into an association in the South or in the East, in some other area, and you would speak on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday through Friday, in a different church every night. And they made a circle of these missionaries. They had 7 missionaries, and they would rotate, and that way a church could hear 7 mission fields, 7 missionaries within a week, right there in their home church. And we use slides and some of the stuff from our people, beadwork and featherwork and all this type of stuff when we went. And so we had, almost immediately, we began to make contacts with churches, and as we shared our needs and things, they began to become involved. And of course, while we were at Kickapoo, we built a church building, and mostly by teens and by college students as we worked on this. But in these World Mission Conferences, we began to make contact with people. One was Jim Nicely in Knoxville, Tennessee, Smithwood Baptist Church, and they later came out and worked with us. And Glenwood Baptist Church from Knoxville came out, and Mount Juliet came out, and there was Murfreesboro came out, Sweetwater, Tennessee, and Cahokia, Illinois, sent, and a lot of these came during the Pine Ridge work, but they started, the contacts were started back there early when we were in Kickapoo, in these World Mission Conferences and things. And so we began to meet the missionaries. We had quarterly meetings where the missionaries would come together, and we would work on our programs and try to share how we were sharing the Lord Jesus with Native Americans. And so so this became, as we become missionaries, we began to become involved with a lot of other people. And a little later, I'm going to share some of these Native Americans that we began to become involved in. But another thing that happened real quickly is we become involved in an Indian association. And for the life of me, I can't remember the name of it. But it went from Ponca City down through Oto, over to Pawnee, down to Only Way Baptist Church at Stroud, to Kickapoo, to Indian Mission in Shawnee, and then clear down to Anadarko, almost the whole western part of Oklahoma. And this was our association, and we had what they called Fifth Sunday meetings. And we'd load up, not have church in our church, we'd load up and drive and haul as many people as we could to these meetings. And we had, here we began to meet other churches, other Native Americans, and we began to see how God worked in their lives. There were some interesting times, some funny times in this. I remember getting ready to go to an associational meeting down in among the Caddos in the southwest part of the state. Got up before daylight, and for some reason Deloris was not going with me that day, and I dressed in the dark, and after the meeting was over, we were to come back by the First Baptist Church in Oklahoma City, which was the largest church in the state of Oklahoma, to the ordination of John Bobo, who was a young man who attended our church, but he was going to be ordained as a deacon. They wanted me to sit on his council. And somewhere along that day, I realized that I had one red and one green sock on, and I kept thinking, man, I've got to change those out. The next time I thought of it, I was setting up on about a 4-foot, 5-foot stage in the First Baptist Church in Oklahoma City, sitting on an ordination council with one green sock and one red sock. But these were times when we got together and we sang, and several of the preachers would preach, and but we would get acquainted with the local people and with the Native Americans and with what the other churches were doing. And one of those churches was the Only Way Baptist Church at Stroud, and I have mentioned already about their pastor, Robert Falls. Robert had a third-grade education, and yet, man, what God had accomplished and was accomplishing in his life. And sometimes I have been discouraged, used to be discouraged with small congregations. Doesn't seem like you can get anybody to go to church and whatever. But every time this happens, I think back of the Only Way Baptist Church. That little church is still in existence today. It's never had over 30 people in church, 30, 35. But out of that church has come, well, there was Alan Morris, the man who was preaching when I was saved, his brother Sam, and I could go on and on and on. There's at least 25 full-time Christian service people that have come out of that one little church. out in a rural church area, and it is just an unbelievable thing, and I had opportunity to be there and see it firsthand, experience it, and so this had an impression upon my early ministry there among the Kickapoos, and I was able to share. I remember one time we were having an annual a meeting in our church, and we had a black pastor, Dr. Watts, from Oklahoma City, and that was the strangest and funniest experience. We were pretty well there. He was going to preach at the 11 o'clock hour for us, and there's this great big Hudson car pulls up, and a great big two great big black men sitting in, one of them driving and one sitting in the front seat. And as soon as he pulls up to the church, this rider opens the door and gets out. Great big guy, top coat, and everything. Opens the back door, and here this little skinny preacher gets out, black preacher, and he walks towards the church, and this guy immediately gets the door open for him and lets him in, and the other one takes the car and parks it and comes around. When Dr. Watts gets in, he walks up to the front of the church and turns his back to his deacon, and his deacon takes his coat off and folds it. And Dr. Watts sits down, and in a little bit he gets up and he preaches, and I mean, man, could he preach. And whenever he got done, he just walked over and turned his back to his deacon. His deacon took his coat, put it on him. The deacon led him as they went out. The other guy had already got out, got the car around, opened the car door. Dr. Watts gets in, door shut. The other guy gets in, and they drive off. Looked like a bunch of gangsters. But this was typical of the black church in that day. They loved their pastor, and they cared for their pastor, and Dr. Watts was one tremendous man. But you see, these all had an impression on me as a young preacher growing up and watching and experiencing these things. But we also had what we called Indian Falls Creek. Indian Falls Creek is down south of Oklahoma City, about 100 miles down by Davis, Oklahoma. And it's on, several hundred acres of mountainous country, similar to the Black Hills. I would say it would be similar to country up around Keystone, up in there. And but Dr. J.B. Rounds, who was one of the early Indian missionaries in Oklahoma way back in the 20s and 30s, went with 2 or 3 other leaders, and they waded across the Ouachita River, carried their suitcases on top of their heads, and walked across the river and found this, what they call Falls Creek, and bought it on the spot and made it into a campground. And there are somewhere around 50,000 people a year. No, way beyond that. Probably 100,000 people a year go to Falls Creek. Well, and what they've done is churches have bought. They laid it out, and they made lots and allowed churches to come in and build cabins. And so there's several hundred cabins around. In fact, the First Baptist Church of Buffalo, Oklahoma, where my wife came from, had a cabin there. And when we went to Indian Falls Creek, we borrowed their cabin and stayed in it. And so we became involved in Falls Creek very early on in our ministry. We would take our young people in it. When we first started going to Indian Falls Creek, there was about 1,000 Indian people that would come. And these were from all over the state of Oklahoma and the surrounding states, and there was even from New Mexico, Arizona, Florida. They came in from a lot of different areas, and we would come for a week of camp, Monday through Friday, and we would have camp pastor, camp missionaries. We would teach classes for the young people. We would have afternoons were open to sports and free time, this type of thing. And it didn't take me very long to become involved in this. And for a good number of years, I was the gatekeeper. We let people in, registered them, and then later registration got bigger and to where it was kind of a safety thing to make sure we didn't get outside people in through the gate. There was always some wild guys in the community that tried to get in and create problems, and I also worked with security. There I taught class. That's where I taught alcohol the destroyer, where I bought me a pint of whiskey and did all kinds of weird experiments with it and this type of thing. But we took a group of young people every year that we were in Oklahoma to Indian Falls Creek. We saw Indian Falls Creek grow from that 900 to 1,000 to over 3,000. And this is the largest Indian encampment in the world of any kind now. And it's still, when I was down to Ralph Hamlin's church last year to do their wild game feed, we went by, they were having their committee meetings. There was 65 people there planning Indian Falls Creek. And it's had such an impact. We took kids from Kickapoo, from Ponca City, and from Hammond. And then when we came back to South Dakota, we even took some of our kids and some of our adults from Pine Ridge clear to Indian Falls Creek, a number of years. And so you see how this is the early days and how the Lord just began to work in these things. Well, it goes way beyond this, because as I worked with Indian Falls Creek, our association had a small camp that they called Leela up close to Ponca City. And I became director of the youth camp up there. I took some young people up there for a year or two, and then I became involved in the leadership of it, and eventually became the director of the of Leela Indian Camp. We'd have 150 adults and kids. We had a tabernacle that was probably 40 by 100 foot, and open aired all but one end of it, and there's where the piano and the pulpit and that type of stuff was. And of course there was a roof over the entire thing, but just it was open on the sides. And we we went into Pawnee and had a swimming area that we swam in there, and played softball, and we had classes and preaching services and missionaries and all this type of thing. And this was the Leela Indian Camp, and it was primarily staffed with our associational pastors and people. Right along with this, I became involved in Royal Ambassadors, and I first began to work down at Falls Creek with Bob Banks, who was the state director, just working with boys, being a counselor. And it was only a couple of years that I served as counselor when we began to have our own Royal Ambassador camp at Leela. And we'd have 60, 70 boys. And it was involved in one of these RA camps up there at Leela, and went into Pawnee for the swimming. There was a great big below the dam of the Pawnee Lake. There was a big area, probably 300 or 400 yards square, and 25 foot deep, and it had an area fenced off for swimming, and it had some towers and things like that in it. And it was in this place that I got over my fear of water. Now, I've been scared to death ever since back there in those Boy Scout days, and I almost drowned 3 times. And when I was a little kid at swimming pool in Dodge City, Kansas, and another time when I was out at an RA camp, we stopped and was in a warm water pool, and I thought I was jumping in 4 foot of water, and I jumped in 10 foot of water and almost drowned. But anyway, I was swimming out across this from one pontoon area to a diving tower, and a lifeguard was up on the tower, and I got to visiting with him, and I said, how deep's that water? Oh, he said, that you come across out there is 25 foot. And I thought, gee, well, if I could do that, then I ought to be able to handle that. So I got over my fear of water, and it wasn't, I don't remember I don't think it was that year, but just a year or two later, we had a boy from Arizona at our Royal Ambassador camp, and he and a boy from Chilocco Indian School and I were running around together, and we went out to swim out there, and this Navajo boy dived off of the board and come up and went to splashing his arms like he was trying to drown, but you know, he had a smile on his face, or we thought he did, and then this other boy from Chilocco dived in, and he come up close to him, and boy, this guy climbed on top of him, and by that time I was in the water, and I saw Leon's face, and I knew that Leon was in trouble. And so I slipped around behind this boy and got a hand behind him and lifted him up and put an elbow in his back, and the guy just relaxed, and I was able to swim out with him and probably saved a tragedy there. And but this all happened at Royal Ambassador camps there, and my involvement with Royal Ambassadors became such that I worked at Leela, and I worked at the RA camp down at Falls Creek, and then later they were given property down around McAllister that became Camp Hudgens, and I worked out of Camp Hudgens with Bob, and I shared the other night when you and I were talking, Damien, that it was in this time that Bob Banks began to groom me and began to work with me, and gosh, I ended up in the mountains of Tennessee with state RA leaders from all over the United States, and I was the only individual there that was not a state Royal Ambassador leader, and Frank Black, who was an old Boy Scout man who had felt convicted to work with Royal Ambassadors and set up a camping program for them, was teaching the course, and I got to spend an entire week up there on that mountain with these guys, and then later I began to work more closely with Bob on special camps, like a travel camp we did in the eastern part of Oklahoma. We took 8 boys and spent a week in training, and then we spent a week out with them, traveling from one area to another, and Frank Black was on that with me, and I know why Bob was grooming me for this, because I was a missionary, I was a pastor, and I knew campcraft, and so he did not have to have 3 different people to work with a group of boys. I could fill out all of the needs there, and so I worked with Bob all the time I was in Oklahoma, and then when I went to Havre, Montana, I came back to work with him, and while I was in Ponca, while I was in Pine Ridge, I was back helping him again. So I spent a lot of time, but you see how those early years as Boy Scouts just began, and God just began to unfold this, and I served as a camp director at Leela as long as I was there, and then I worked in the camp with Bob at McAllister, and then when I moved to South Dakota and become involved at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, I directed Royal Ambassador camps for 20 years up in the Black Hills, and did counselor training and leadership training and all of these things that were outlined by Frank Black. And we had, in those early days, we had 150 boys in RA camp. And so all of this just came together really in those years that I was at Kickapoo. And there's one other area that probably, at least to me, was the most. It let me rub shoulders with some of the greatest Native Americans that there ever has been. B. Frank Belvin was director of Indian work in Oklahoma when we began to do work there. Then he became with the Home Mission Board, and B. Frank was the one that got Deloris and I started in Indian mission work. B. Frank Belvin had the first earned doctor's degree from college of any Native American in the United States. He has served on committees with presidents and actively involved, and but he's as common as an old everyday shoe, and yet he had that. And now bring alongside of him another man, and this was Elliot Lika, and both of them were Creeks. Bring along Elliot Lika. Elliot Lika had an 8th grade education. There used to be the days of study courses, and there was somewhere around 150 or 200 different kind of study courses that you could take. Bible studies and how-tos, deacons, and Sunday school, and all kinds of things. Elliot Lika had studied every study course book that was available. He had credit for every study course book. He only had an 8th grade education, but he could stand on a par right alongside of B. Frank Belvin. He spoke with integrity. He was the same type of individual, but from totally different backgrounds. And I've been in many, many meetings with these two men. They were both just so very special to me. And I remember we were at Big Sandy Church just outside of Tulsa for a Indian Leadership Conference. Elliot and Frank was standing out there in the front of the church, and I'd walked up and had a beaded bolo tie on, and pretty nice. And B. Frank looked over at Elliot, and he said, "Boy," he said, "Harold's really got a pretty tie on." And Elliot said, "Man, he does." And so they were really commenting on my tie, and I knew these guys like a book. And so they kept after this for a little while, and I said, "I'm sorry, guys, but you can't have it." And B. Frank turned to Elliot and he said, "Darn, another one of those young Indians. If he's an old Indian, he'd have taken it off and given it to us." And but I remember those two guys were just so precious. Aaron Hancock and Hilda, his wife, missionaries to the Creeks, associational missionaries, such dear, dear, dear friends. And I could just go on and on and on of these individuals and how each one of them touched my life. And I walked among, and I still walk among, Oklahoma Indians, not as an Anglo missionary, but as an Indian missionary, because of the love and the time that we spent together. And Samaria Leader was a state WMU president for our Indian churches, and her husband Sam, and there's so many rich experiences. So I wanted to bring all this together because this is really what has made me what I have become. There's another thing that I need to add in this. Back during those early days at Kickapoo, we had opportunity to build a building, and you remember that my whole background had been a blacksmithing background, and I knew nothing about building. I knew nothing about how to make a church work. And it was long in that time that I made a promise to God that if God would allow me to learn anything, that I would do it. And he opened up so many open doors to me. So many things. Over the years, we've built a church building at Kickapoo. We built a church and a parsonage at Hammond. We built, finished up a building in Havre, Montana. We built 2 churches, a parsonage, and built onto the parsonage at Pine Ridge. And all of this I was able to do on that first building we built at Kickapoo. We had a man who was in charge of our maintenance at OBU that I worked for part of the time, and he would show me how to do things. And Joel Heffley's dad, who became a legislator in Washington, D.C., his father was an architect, and he drew up our plans for our church and made them simple enough that a dummy like me could read them, and showed me and told me. And at the lumber yard, they helped me, and we had a block layer that contributed, and I was able to add to this, and it's from this promise that I made the Lord if he'd help me to learn, and so I have. And so anyway, this kind of maybe sets the background for where I came from.